Often, a great artist has the ability to clarify complicated questions, allowing the viewer to see and understand something new. Such was the gift of the important American sculptor Augustus Saint-Gaudens. Telling stories in bronze, forever frozen in the present, the faces of Saint-Gaudens figures reveal depths of emotion as their postures convey a range of motion. Often standing on platforms that invite us into their presence, we're swept along by stories that never tire, speaking to us eloquently about the past in a way that is still fresh today. Barnard Saint-Gaudens, the father of Augustus, was a shoemaker born in the Pyrenees Mountains of southern France. He met his wife, Mary McGuinness, in Dublin, Ireland, where in 1848 Augustus, one of 3 sons, was born. 6 months later, the potato famine crisis prompted the family to emigrate to a more promising life in America, where Barnard set up a shoe shop in New York City. The father encouraged his boys to work with their hands, and in 1861, when Augustus was 13 years old, Barnard found his red-haired son an apprenticeship carving cameos. Excelling in this detailed art of stones and shells, Augustus worked during daytime hours and attended art classes at the National Academy of Design and Cooper Union in the evenings. It was in these settings that his talent as a sculptor became evident. He studied with some of the leading American artists, gaining confidence and skill in drawing, painting, and design. The backdrop for Augustus' teen years was dominated by the Civil War. Barnard was an abolitionist, and the importance of the war and its heroes was not lost on the budding artist. He was in the crowd outside Cooper Union in 1860 when presidential candidate Abe Lincoln spoke. And 5 years later, when the body of the tragically assassinated president was brought to New York, Augustus waited in line twice to view his fallen hero. In 1867, when Augustus turned 19 and ended his apprenticeship, his father presented him with a ticket to France, a world center of Western art and education. There, Augustus studied with great artists at the rigorous and prestigious École des Beaux-Arts. In 1870, France went to war with Prussia, and Augustus went to Rome. There he learned to incorporate classical and Renaissance aesthetics into his sculpture. He set up a studio where he produced some of his earliest works for wealthy American patrons. One of his first commissions came from a New Yorker, for whom Augustus created a statue of the great Iroquois chief, Hiawatha. Symbolic of the various cultures that defined him, this initial sculpture combined a very American figure with a European neoclassical sculptural style. Rome was also the place where Augustus met Augusta Homer, who would become his wife. Like Augustus, Augusta was an American studying art in Rome. When Augustus requested the permission of her traditional Boston father to marry his daughter, his proposal was met with a condition. Augustus was challenged to get a first major commission for his work, demonstrating his ability to support a wife. The commission came in 1876 in the form of a monument to Admiral David G. Farragut, a Civil War naval hero. The sculpture was planned for New York's Madison Square Park. With this first major commission, he gained Augusta's hand in marriage. Unlike the great sculptures that adorned parks and squares across Europe, few monuments decorated public spaces in the United States at that time, and the Farragut gave Saint-Gaudens the opportunity to create one of the early examples. The statue of the hero itself was so realistic that even today, viewers drawn into its magnetism feel temporarily transported to the deck of a ship rocking on a turbulent ocean. The Admiral's legs stand apart to balance his body, while he faces into the imaginary wind, his buttoned, uniformed coat billowing back. In creating the figure, Saint-Gaudens emulated the style of Italian Renaissance sculptors, notably Donatello. Farragut was cast in unyielding bronze, though every aspect of his pose suggests motion. The pedestal, in contrast, was constructed from bluestone, suggestive of the ocean. Carvings of sea and allegorical figures, as well as lettering, adorn the base, quite opposite in style from the detailed realism of the man in the statue. For Saint-Gaudens, viewer interaction with sculpture in a public place was a critical element of the work. The way to achieve that, he knew, was through the creation of a pedestal in a landscape setting that would integrate with the figure. For that, he turned to American architect Stanford White. The pedestal White designed includes 2 benches, inviting passers-by to sit and reflect on Farragut's heroism and patriotism. The Farragut represented the emergence of a new form of sculpture that consciously mixed classic with modern and sculpture with architecture and landscape design to create a single, unified work of art. The media reaction after the Farragut unveiling in 1861 was extraordinary. Although already noticed in artistic circles, the young sculptor now became known to the general public as he had never been before. In the ensuing years, Saint-Gaudens received a number of commissions for reliefs, a form of art that bridges drawing and sculpture with figures rising 3-dimensionally out of the flat background. He worked in the traditional way, first sketching in clay, before casting in the more permanent medium of plaster. When final changes were made to the plaster, the work could be sent to the foundry for casting in bronze. He also received the commission that resulted in the powerful sculpture in Washington, D.C., for the grave of Marion Hooper Adams. The wife of the historian, Henry Adams, she had taken her own life. Saint-Gaudens once described the work as the mystery of the hereafter and the peace of God that passeth understanding. By 1885, the artist had a home and a studio in New York. He was also the father of a young son, Homer. At the urging of Augusta, beginning that year, the family rented a house in Cornish, New Hampshire, for the summers, eventually purchasing it. Saint-Gaudens named the property Aspet, after the town of his father's birth in southern France. The lure of the peaceful haven spread to other artists and friends who followed in his footsteps, ultimately creating what came to be known as the Cornish colony. For the sociable Saint-Gaudens, Cornish provided a welcome community of shared artistic inspiration, storytelling, music, and entertainment. Saint-Gaudens converted the barn on the property to a studio, where he brought his assistants, who helped him create some of his large-scale sculptures, like Abraham Lincoln for Lincoln Park in Chicago. As with the Farragut, Saint-Gaudens was determined to capture Lincoln in motion, in this case as the President of the United States during the Civil War, deep in thought. He created as a significant element of the sculpture a chair from which Lincoln has just risen. To model the piece, he used an original life mask casting of Lincoln's face, made when he was running for office. For the body, Saint-Gaudens hired as a model a tall local resident whose build resembled Lincoln's. True to Saint-Gaudens' signature, the realism of the Lincoln is juxtaposed with idealism, represented by the inclusion of the ancient Greek-style chair. The viewer's eye moves from the tall Lincoln down to the chair, then further downward to the pedestal. Collaborating again with the architect Stanford White, the Lincoln is set on an elongated base with benches providing visibility to this contemplative and humble American icon. Saint-Gaudens received the commission for the Shaw Memorial 3 years after the dedication of the Farragut, but he labored over the sculpture for 14 years, ultimately completing it in 1897. The Shaw Memorial sits on the edge of the Boston Common and honors Civil War Colonel Robert Gould Shaw and the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, the first volunteer regiment of African American troops raised in the North. On May 28, 1863, they marched down Beacon Street, past the State House on their way to the ship which would take them to South Carolina. Shaw and many of the soldiers later died in an unsuccessful assault on Fort Wagner near Charleston Harbor. The monumental relief depicts Shaw erect on his horse, sword down and eyes staring resolutely ahead. The troops march alongside. The distinctiveness of each individual emphasized by varying the sculptural technique from low to high relief, bordering on sculpture in the round. Common to all are expressions of courage and determination. An allegorical angel, representing peace or death, depending upon the interpretation, hovers over the group. Another example of Saint-Gaudens' integration of real and ideal. The 1900 Exposition Universelle de Paris, the World's Fair, was held 3 years after the Shaw was dedicated. For Saint-Gaudens, the fair provided an opportunity to showcase a number of his reliefs and several of his major works. Powerful and evocative, the Shaw was given a prominent spot in the gallery of the Grand Palais. The famous French sculptor, Augustus Saint-Gaudens, stopped in front of it and, in a public manner recorded by the press, removed his hat and bowed. Another Saint-Gaudens statue, exhibited at the 1900 Paris World's Fair, was the work-in-progress version of the Equestrian monument to Civil War General William Tecumseh Sherman. A well-known Major General for the Union forces during the Civil War, Sherman led the famous march through Georgia to seize Atlanta. In bringing Sherman to life, he relied upon the bust he had sculpted of the general in 1888 and created a precise rendition of Sherman on his horse, moving through an imaginary battlefield, wind blowing back the general's cloak, tension evident in his face. The wild energy of the horse was tempered by the cool intellect of the rider. To this powerful narrative, Saint-Gaudens added his element of the ideal, the winged angel of victory leading the general onward. In 1900, as he was in the midst of creating the sculpture, Saint-Gaudens was diagnosed with cancer. Unable to travel as frequently as he once had, he decided to settle in Cornish year-round, maintaining a full plate of work. Key among his priorities was completing the Sherman. The monument was unveiled along New York's prestigious Fifth Avenue and Grand Army Plaza on Memorial Day in 1903, 11 years after it was first commissioned. The next few years of Saint-Gaudens' life were filled with hurdles. Frailty was slowly overcoming him, and in 1904, his large studio in Cornish went up in flames. Yet, his will to create never waned. Within months of the fire, the studio was rebuilt, and he employed a number of assistants under his supervision. His wife Augusta devoted herself to managing the studio. On June 22, 1905, over 80 members of the Cornish colony gathered on the lower lawn of Aspet to perform an elaborate outdoor pageant. The Mask, a performance in the ancient Greek tradition, depicted the Greek god Zeus renouncing the throne, with different gods vying for the job. Minerva must choose and seeks the answer from the magical golden bowl, which deems Saint-Gaudens the worthy leader. Saint-Gaudens' last major project began in January 1905, when President of the United States Theodore Roosevelt approached the artist to design a new United States coinage. For Roosevelt, the embellishment of American coins with a majestic design by the country's greatest sculptor underscored the prominence of the nation as a world power. The artist used high-relief Greek and Roman coins for his inspiration, combined with American symbols. He modeled his concept of liberty after the angel of victory he had created to lead Sherman on his horse, fusing liberty and victory to form his notion of America. Other images included an eagle soaring across the sky and an Indian headdress. The $10 and $20 gold pieces Saint-Gaudens designed were minted from 1907 until 1933. The sculptor died on August 3, 1907, at Aspet. His legacy lives on in more than 150 works of art he sculpted during his life, including the famous Diana, Saint-Gaudens' only female nude, which in its initial rendition served as a revolving weather vane atop the tower of Madison Square Garden and was the first statue to be illuminated by electricity. The sculptor's legacy was also passed down through the art created by his many students and the preservation of his life and works at the Saint-Gaudens National Historic Site. Located on the grounds of Aspet in Cornish, New Hampshire, the National Park Service maintains the site. Today, visitors can take a look into the home, Aspet, still furnished as it was during Saint-Gaudens' life. They can view the little studio, which housed Saint-Gaudens' workshop, and the new gallery, where some of the sculptor's greatest works can be found. Bronze casts of the Farragut monument as well as the Adams and Shaw memorials are exhibited on the grounds. You are invited to step into the world of Saint-Gaudens. The natural beauty of the surrounding countryside inspired the sculptor as it does visitors today. As you stand on the porch, looking across the fields toward the mountains beyond, you also can experience the special quality of place that allowed his artistic vision to flourish.